Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to welcome you to the Neuroscience Interest Group of International Society for Addiction Medicine Symposium that is being organized by a group of colleagues and collaborators that we have in the Neuroscience Interest Group. And I hope that you will enjoy the discussions that we'll have in this symposium. So let me share my screen and see what we have here. Okay. So in this symposium that is going to be about cue-based interventions, mainly cognitive interventions or behavior interventions for addiction medicine. We are going to give you an idea about what are the new advances in developing new treatments based on drug-related cues and how drug-related cues could be used for assessing and developing new interventions. So I will give you an overview about what we have and what we are going to do in cue-based interventions, and then the symposium co-chair and Neuroscience Interest Group co-chair, Dr. Antonio Verdajo Garcia, will give you an idea about what will be the next steps and how you can be involved in this process and in this kind of collaborative initiative that we have. Okay, my talk will be mainly focused on an overview about what is happening in the field and how we can use basically cue-based interventions and how cue-based interventions could be used for developing new interventions. As being a researcher in the field of cognitive neuroscience of addiction and how we can develop new interventions based on neuroscience for addiction treatment, I realized from the first days of working with drug users, I realized that anything that would be related to their drug use history, whether there are photos or even words or any kind of smell, anything that would be related to their drug use, would be able to induce a really profound response, emotional, motivational, appetitive response among drug users. And that kind of the specific response has always been an interesting kind of topic for further exploration in my lab in terms of, okay, how that response would end up to drug use behavior, how that response would end up to drug craving, and how we might be able to modulate that response in a way that we can help people to kind of remain abstinent from using drugs. So as you can see here in this kind of experimental setting, we have been exposing a group of heroin users to different pictorial cues related to heroin injection. And this is what we call kind of laboratory cue exposure. And this laboratory cue exposure is a sort of the main core of this symposium that we are going to discuss in terms of how laboratory cue exposure could be a part of a treatment or a treatment development. So we know that this kind of cue exposure could be happening in a controlled environment. We can have different modalities. We can have visual pictures, words, scripts, or auditory, or even we can have a smell or kind of taste of some of the drugs like alcohol as something like cue, and then we can have them presented as kind of pictures, as you can see in this kind of figure that I'm showing you. We just printed them and mounted them on the wall, or even we can use advanced technologies like virtual reality. One of the speakers in this panel will be talking about how virtual reality could be used as cue presentation method. And then there could be different contents within these cues. These cues could be individualized or could be general. So there are cues that are almost all the drug users are responsive to, or we can basically tailor cues that we are presenting to people based on their history or based on their experiences. So we can even develop individualized scripts for each individual subject or individual participant or patient that would be kind of inducing kind of cue reactivity among them. People can be expecting to use drugs after cue exposure, or there could be an anticipation for drug use, especially for those who are active drug users. When they leave the lab, there might be an expectation for drug use, or for those who are still, for example, kind of cigarette smokers, when they leave the lab, they might still be able to kind of use drugs, or there could be people who are just back to the treatment environment and they do not have kind of any expectation for drug use. And people can have different responses to drug use based on this kind of contextual situation. And there's always a question in terms of, okay, if we expose people to drug-related cues, could it make them habituated to these drug-related cues, or these drug-related cues could just sensitize them and make them prone to kind of being more responsive to the next drug cues? We have recently kind of published a paper, and we have been exposing people inside the scanner to drug-related cues, and we have been asking them, okay, you see those drug cues, and you are supposed to rate how much craving you are experiencing. We have been recording what is happening in their brain. For example, as you can see here, in a discovery sample, we had 60 subjects with meth use disorder. We have been recording the response in their ventromedial prefrontal cortex. As you can see here, there is a significant habituation here in terms of response to drug-related cues in ventromedial prefrontal cortex, in this specific ROI. And over time, there is a kind of a habituation in response. And we have been able to show in 2 different replication samples in 2 other clinical settings, 2 groups of something like 30 subjects in each group. We showed that we can replicate the same sort of habituation and habituational response to drug-related cues in the same area in the brain. But it's quite interesting that we showed that if you kind of do the exposure again in the next session, those areas that are being habituated, they remain habituated. So there is no response in the next round. And the habituation would be the dominant response to drug-related kind of pictures. The important part is we know that there are interesting responses inside the brain to drug-related cues, and these responses could be dynamic and changes over time. There was a question of, in terms of, is it ethical to expose people to drug-related cues or not? And there have been lots of discussions about that. But the conclusion, based on hundreds of studies that people have done with drug cue exposure in different laboratory settings, is that it could be ethical if we consider all the precautions that are supposed to be taken care of in terms of making sure that people would be kind of, their craving would be managed and they kind of leave the lab in a kind of safe environment. So there are some specific precautions, but at the end of the day, it could be ethical in an environment, and it could even be therapeutic. So we'll discuss about how being exposed to drug cues could provide opportunities to do interventions that would eventually help those who are being exposed to these drug-related cues to remain abstinent in long term. As you can imagine, if you want to expose people to drug-related cues, you need to have a kind of large database of those drug-related cues. So we need to have databases. So over the time, we develop different databases. This is one of the databases we have recently developed for opioid and meth users, and has 360 drug cues inside. We have done an intensive validation study for that. This database is now publicly available, so people can have access to that database. And there are several details about how that is being done. People in other areas like alcohol use studies or kind of cannabis use or smoking, they also develop different databases and they publish their databases, so you can have access to the database. So there are kind of available tools if you want to do the sort of a controlled validated cue exposure. And then we can basically develop what we call fMRI tasks for having both neutral or control cues and also drug-related cues, and then exposing people to these 2 types of drug cues, and then see what are the brain activations that are unique to drug cue exposure, and just subtract the other things that are basically basic visual processing, or all the other things that would be happening also in those drug cues. So we subtract them and we just keep the activations related to drug cues, and that would end up to, different brain maps of showing that, okay, there are specific areas. For example, we have specific activations in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. We have activations here, for example, in amygdala. We have activation in several other areas in the prefrontal cortex or in the striatum. So there are specific areas that are activated, and we can show these activations even in what we call kind of the brainotome atlas, in 246 different regions. So each of these bars would represent one of those 246 regions. For example, these are the subcortical areas and these two are amygdala. So you can see that there is significant activation of amygdala. So we can show them even in the kind of different regions of the brain, that some of the regions in the brain are responsive to these drug-related cues. So we have fMRI biomarkers or fMRI measures of how brain would be responding to these drug cues, which is quite important in terms of having those measures to see how the interventions that we are developing are effective in changing these activations. We also developed a consensus statement in terms of how we can measure these brain activation inside the scanner using these drug cues. This has been recently published in Nature Protocols, and this is publicly available, so we can use that one as well. So we also know that, these activations could be kind of categorized in different major neurocircuits that are important for drug addiction. Things like executive circuit or salience circuits. The circuits are important in field of drug addiction. And all these circuits would be engaged when we expose people to drug-related cues, which is a kind of another opportunity to be able to see, okay, how we can develop interventions to modulate these neural circuits that are important in field of drug addiction. So we also developed what we call an easy core model that would summarize the responses in the brain in a dynamic way. So when we expose people, this is an environmental cue. When we expose people to drug-related cues, we have different cognitive functions engaged. Attentional processing, saliency processing, interoception, control, memory, all these things would be involved and they would interact with each other. So we have multiple cognitive processes involved in what we call drug cue exposure. And these are all great opportunities for developing different sorts of interventions. And this is what we usually try to even summarize the brain, kind of the brain processes that are involved in drug cue reactivity. And we have been recently thinking about, okay, if these are cognitive processes that are involved, how we might be able to modulate these, let's say, attentional processing, saliency processing, memories related to drugs, interoception processing related to drugs, control processing related to drugs, and then how we might be able to do fMRI before and after and see, okay, if we modulate these kind of responses, can we measure that the changes in the brain and what is happening inside the brain? In a recent trial that we are almost at the end of the trial, we developed a specific intervention called neurocognitive empowerment for addiction treatment (NEAT), that we are targeting these kind of easy core model cognitive functions, and we developed a kind of a set of cartoons and interventions in 16 sessions that are covering these domains of cognitive functions, and many of them are based on the kind of the cue exposures that we have. But over the time, we realized that we can have a kind of shorter intervention that are just focused to any brain responses that would be activated by drug cues. And we developed a new paradigm that we call CREF, that we will discuss about that. And Panyan, one of the kind of the colleagues that are working with me, she will present the ideas that we have for the CREF intervention, which is a cue-based intervention, but is in combination with other interventions that we are using. So there are opportunities with these drug cues to develop different sorts of interventions. But it's not just cognitive interventions, because we can also have brain stimulation interventions that are also combined with cue exposure. For example, recently, deep TMS machines received FDA approval for being used in nicotine use disorder, but it is not just the deep TMS. They are supposed to be kind of associated with drug cues. So they are supposed to see drug-related or nicotine-related cues or smoking-related cues, and then receive the stimulation. So that is a combination that would be that would make it kind of effective. So even those interventions could be considered as cue-based interventions. So we provide the cues, they activate areas that are important for drug craving and drug cue reactivity, and then we modulate those areas with brain stimulation. In my lab, we are doing what we call concurrent fMRI. So we do stimulation inside the scanner while we are recording what is happening inside the brain. And this is the setting that we have. During the fMRI, we basically expose people to MET and neutral-related cues. So we have drug-related cues. So we expose them to these drug-related cues. And then we try to modulate the frontoparietal connectivity and see how modulation frontoparietal connectivity could change the drug craving. So even these sort of brain stimulation interventions could be cue-based. So we use drug cues to be able to run these sort of interventions. let's conclude about what we have been discussing about today and kind of open the panel for, or open the symposium for others to present what they are actually developing for these sort of Q-based interventions. First of all, we know that Q presentation could be a safe, ethical procedure in a controlled environment. So that's a kind of interesting area for further research. A Q exposure could provide a good opportunity to kind of activate scenarios for those who are going to be prone to drug use. So when they see those drug-related cues, they basically can talk about the specific scenarios related to drug use, but this could be happening in a safe environment inside the laboratory, and that would provide opportunities for interventions. These sort of Q exposure paradigms could be personalized, and we can even provide them through mobile apps or virtual reality. That is another opportunity that with drug cues we can develop interventions. And we know that these drug-related cues could activate neural circuits that are related to drug addiction, and we have specific fMRI-based measures to see that, okay, if we do an intervention, we can do fMRI before and after and see, okay, have been able to engage those targets or change those brain activations that are important for drug addiction, and see how we might be able to measure the response to these interventions. We know that when we expose people to drug-related cues, several cognitive processes are being engaged: attention, memory, interoception, control, and these cognitive processes could be target for further interventions. And we'll discuss about those interventions in the next presentations. We know that based on kind of a limited amount of evidence that we have, that probably Q exposure alone, even when we know that Q exposure could make a level of habituation, we have not been able to show that there is a significant clinical benefit for Q exposure alone as a standalone intervention. But it seems that if we can combine Q exposure with other interventions, there are definitely some other opportunities. And that is what we are going to discuss in terms of how Q exposure could be combined with other things to initiate or augment other interventions. What will be the next steps? I highly encourage you to kind of listen to the next speakers that are going to talk about different interventions that they develop in their different labs in terms of working memory, kind of attention, approach bias modifications, or memory, and how these things could be modulated with Q-based interventions. And then my esteemed colleague, Antonio, will be talking about how we are trying to kind of harmonize what people are doing in the field of Q exposure, Q-based interventions, or cognitive interventions, drug addiction, and how you might be able to kind of be a part of these sort of consensus statements that we are developing to harmonize what people are doing in the field of drug addiction treatment development, and how you can be a part of this sort of collaborative initiative that we have in the International Society for Addiction Medicine. Thank you very much for your attention.